Good morning, everybody. So we were in the middle of looking at this piece from a sefer called Hegyonei HaParsha. So let me bring that up again, and it's basically a sefer that brings up different essays on the parsha. But this essay is, does a Jew have to pay taxes? So he was basically quoting all of our sources that we are familiar with by now, quoting the Rav Shulchan Aruch, but then also quoting from others who feel that even though the Rav Shulchan Aruch is quite exhortative of being machmir and considering tax evasion as an act of gezela, he says that there are others who feel that it is merely hafkas halva, a failure to pay back a debt to a non-Jew, and therefore the remaining prohibition is chil Hashem and not gezela. That doesn't mean that it's okay. It just means that if you can create a scenario where there's no chil Hashem, then there would not be gezela according to those other opinions. That's he's quoting from Rav Sternbach, and then he writes Vahosif, and then he writes as follows. He adds additionally, Diyesh litzadeid shebizman hazeh shiny. One could also argue that when we live without monarchy in democratic Western societies and political structures, one could say that maybe there's a difference. And the difference is V'yesh svara michad gisa shilukuli alma aser, v'yesh gam svara lahefech lahater lukuli alma. That on the one hand, maybe everyone would argue that today it's more problematic, and maybe everyone would agree that perhaps today it's less problematic to commit tax evasion. V'hainu dehayom hamemshala mishtamshim b'hakesef shel hamisim letoeles ulahanas hatoshavim v'lo magia hayom lekiso haprati shel hamelech. He says because today, when the government collects taxes, what does it do with that money? It's not there to fortify the treasury of the king, but it's rather to be used by the entire citizenry to the benefit of the citizenry. And if anything, just look at Ontario. We're constantly running at a deficit, which means that we're taking in taxes less money than what we're putting out and providing for the citizens of the province. V'lochein hayom im nehene mehasherutim shehamemshala notenet v'lo mishalem avuram hu gazlan. So from that standpoint, benefiting from the provincial benefits or the federal benefits that this country or the province provides without paying your fair share of taxes makes you a gazlan. You're not a gazlan by not paying taxes. You're a gazlan by taking the benefits, the OHIP and the garbage collection and all of the municipal benefits without paying for them. V'im ki yesh litzadeid sheyesh gam dvarim shemevazvizim aleihem kesef ve'ein lo mizeh toelet. Now, you may argue, but yes, it's not like I pay zero taxes. I pay some taxes, but I don't pay other taxes. And the government always spends its tax money on frivolous things also. They'll fund a certain university that deals in the humanities and teaches people about lesbian basket weaving or whatever kind of strange studies that I have no benefit from. He says, but that's true in any collective, in any country. There are going to be benefits that the government provides that you don't benefit from, and there are going to be benefits that you do benefit from. V'im kain keshamit chamek milishalem lamrot sheneheneh zehu gezela sha'asu lekuli alma gamei akum. And therefore, in other words, if every citizen of the country would say, I'm only going to pay for taxable services that I benefit from, then no one would pay taxes. And therefore, based on that, if a person evades paying that which he for the taxes, and he ends up benefiting from the government, that's gezela. Ubifrat sha'acherim uveineim gam Yehudim yishalmu lahana'ato, and that's especially true when others are paying for you, and many of those others are Jewish themselves. So you're actually taking the money from both Jews and non-Jews by not paying your fair share. Umitzad acher yesh lomar da'anshe hamemshala yodi'im de'cheshe'efshar lehitchamek mitashlum hamas mitchamkim. So he says, but there's another, on the other hand, he says, there's another reason why a person may wish to be lenient. And that is because when the government authorities are aware that every time a person has the opportunity to evade paying their fair share of tax, they do so. And therefore, when they send out the tax notice to collect the taxes, they state that everyone has to pay a certain amount of tax unless they have a way of legally avoiding it. He says, if everyone would pay their fair share, what they're supposed to, the government would not have to tax as much as they currently do. In other words, rak mitchashvim she'achuz mesuyam mehamisim lo magia liyadam. He says, but the government takes into account that the tax table that they set up is established based on the fact that a certain percentage of people are not going to pay their taxes. And some say that it may be up to 25%. And he says, and if you pay your full amount, you'll be paying more than what the government had assumed that everyone would pay. And therefore, what a person may wish to rationalize doing is basically saying, I have to figure that everyone else in my community, in my province, is also not paying their fair share, so I'm no different from everybody else. In other words, it's basically the rationale is that the government already knows when they tax that not everyone is going to pay their fair share. They take that into account. And so therefore, the argument is, I find this argument completely dissatisfying, to be honest. But he says the argument is that if the government already knows that most people or many people are not going to be paying their fair share, then as long as you are not paying less than per capita what other people in your situation are paying, then you're okay. The reason why this doesn't make sense, this argument, is because most people get an accountant when they have a large enough income, and they go through their accountant, and their accountant tells them how much they have to pay. And the accountant looks for all different kinds of legal ways of not paying the taxes based on tax shelters and structures and things like that. But to say that, this is an oversimplification of the argument, which doesn't take into account the legal loopholes that exist. People, paying cash under the table is not something that the government takes into consideration when they tax. V'siyem devarav d'lamaisa kvar bir sherabani Yisrael eino morin b'zeh klal lo le'isr v'lo le'heter. And then he concludes his tshuva by saying, Rav Sternbach, that with what he started with, which is that, the fact of the matter is that because there's a certain grayness to this shaila, the rabbanim of most Chutz La'aretz communities have not issued a definitive psak halacha to say that it either is gezela or it's not gezela. V'kach nohagu rabosenu dor, and this has been the tradition, which is strange. V'hamachmir tavo alav bracha, and he who wishes to be machmir should receive a blessing. Uvazeh gam zocha liot yashar b'chol derachav b'lo l'shaker la'olam. And with this, he will merit to be upright in all of his ways and will never have to lie. So, anyway, I find this to be a the most dissatisfying responsum. It's important to know Rav Sternbach is a brilliant scholar, is quite an elderly man by now, and sits on the Badatz, the Beit Din Tzedek of the Eidah Charedit in Jerusalem, but is also an anti-Zionist, and is and because of his anti-Zionist ideas, he might be anti-government in general. But the point is that to say that rabbis have not ruled on this issue is really not so accurate. I mean, we saw the Rav Shulchan Aruch say clearly that it is, at least according to the Rambam, it is gezela. He brought the other opinion, but said that it's proper to be machmir. So I don't understand why he feels that this is not something that he can weigh in on. All right, so now let's go on to another tshuva that he brings down, which is from Rav Menashe Klein of blessed memory, who also was an anti-Zionist, but that's not relevant. Rav Menashe Klein lived in Brooklyn for most of his life, and he writes as follows: Kosav bedavar imuter lahavriach hamechas b'medinos ka'artzot habrit v'chayotze bahem she'ein bahem shilton sherodeh ha'am elahu ke'ein de demokratia imze bichlal gezelakum. Here too, I forgot to turn on the YouTube today, or did I? Oh no, I am running. Okay, so the question is, are you allowed to evade taxes in a democracy which is not oppressive to its citizens? Are you stealing from a non-Jew? Uvidivar of Kosav al pi Rashi, Vizel Lashona. He quotes a Rashi, Rashi commentary on the Gemara in Bava Kama, and writes, She'ein gezel mamish sharik, ileka chilul Hashem, ulahavriach hamecha savi kahavkas halva'aso adkan. So he quotes Rashi, who says that it's not actual gezel, but there's still the chilul Hashem aspect, but it's only havkas halva'a, which is failing to pay back a debt. In a case of Rashi meforash de lahavriach b'meches avi havkas halva'aso ein sham. And therefore, it would be permitted, provided that there's no chilul Hashem. Bahosif hamishna halachos shebedin ze ein afgemina ikaimol andina de malchus adina o sheleka malchus. He says, based on this, it really doesn't matter whether the law of the land is the law or whether there's anarchy. I don't really understand what he's saying. He's alluding to something that he wishes to conceal. It's not really clear, but his argument was perhaps there's no law of Dina de Malchusa, which is just obscure. But he's basically saying that it's irrelevant. The fact of the matter is, but he says, but I want you to be aware of that Rabbeinu Yonah, who's one of the medievalists, writes that one must be careful and not commit tax evasion, because he who commits tax evasion is in danger of losing his entire estate. Ach b'makom nosav, nireh shehamishna halachos kosav acheres, b'shut mishna halachos lina mavrich min hameches u'magia nezik lechaveru kosav devadai shasur lasos kain. But then he's more machmir in another response, where he says that if the ramifications to others is going to cause them damage, So then you're certainly not allowed to evade paying taxes, to commit tax evasion, tax fraud. Because he says definitively that we paskin that the law of the land is the law. And he says, without any equivocation in a different responsum, that certainly in America where we live, we are obligated, according to the laws of the land, to pay our taxes. And so that's really his review of some of the contemporary poskim. Rav Moshe, as a matter of course, he had quoted above and basically said, there's no question that if a person has to pay their taxes, and he was responding to a person who wanted to do tshuva for that. And the only equivocation that Rav Moshe had was, is there an obligation to pay back taxes where from previous years that you had not paid your proper share? So anyway, okay. All right. The rest of this essay is talking about the laws in Eretz Yisrael, where the author lives. Is there an issue of Dina de Malchusa Dina if you live in Eretz Yisrael? And there may be certain aspects that are different in Israel because of the law that the land does not belong to any specific memshala, any specific government entity, until the Messiah comes. So in the final analysis, he writes over here, he says, Begeder hadinim sheyesh bahem dina de malchus dina, rov haposkim sovrim da hamelech shechakak din chadash shelo haya ken bechukei hamalachim harishonim, kol shehishva bo et kol bnei habedina dino din. So the consensus of most poskim is that any law that is instituted by a governmental authority has the status of law, and that all of the citizens of that country, both Jew and non-Jew alike, are obligated to follow that law. Kein nifsak b'shulchan aruch b'hilchos gezela v'zelashano klalo shel davar kol din sheyachkok oso hamelech l'chol v'lo yeh la'adam echad b'fnei atzmo eno geza. Any law that has to do with finance that is instituted fairly among its citizenry, distributed fairly, and where all the money will not go into the coffers of just one person, is not gezel. V'chol sheyikach me'ish zeh bilvad shelo kedas hayedu alakol ele chamas is hareze gezel. And if however the king takes from one person unfairly, then he's committing an act of gezel. And then he says, Begeder melech she'amar bodina de malchus adina, harambam hatur ve'ashulchan aruch pasku de din hamelech din v'hu sheyehi matbeo yotzei ba'otam ha'aratzot. He says, defining who is the king of a government depends on, whether he's currently recognized using that his face is on the currency. And that in itself is evidence that they have made him their king. If not, if he's not recognized as the king, but he still confiscates property, so that makes him a gazlan. Okay, so that's fairly obvious. And then in this synopsis, he writes, Nechlaku harishonim im hadin shel dina de malchus adina nemar af b'malchi Yisrael be'eretz Yisrael. There's a machlokes whether the law of the land has to be followed to the same extent when you're dealing with people who are political leaders in the land of Eretz Yisrael, and that in itself is a separate machlokes. And and then here he writes le'inin havracha mimeches uchashash chilul Hashem mefurash b'gemar nedarim ubava kama shedina de malchus adina shaykh b'nisim. We know that the law of the land is the law, applies to tax payment. V'nifsak b'shulchan aruch b'hilchos gezela shahamavriach mimoche shamido hamelech legavos over alo sigzol mipnei shu gozel menas hamelech. The Gemara says straight out that if you don't pay the taxes that are assessed upon you, you're committing gezel. That's a Gemara in Nedarim, and this Gemara is cited by the Shulchan Aruch. However, that's in some way counterbalanced by the fact that in the Gemara in Bava Kama, it also says that not paying back a debt that you owe to a non-Jew does not have the same status as gezel. And there's a machlokes whether that applies to the government authorities. And the conclusion is that you're still not allowed to evade the taxes. Even when there's no fear of Chilul Hashem, you still would not be allowed to evade paying your taxes. And so basically, let's see, he refers us to a sefer called Darchei Mishpat, who writes, I didn't see this in the original essay. He writes, Shekasav de b'memshalot dechutz la'aretz dinei hamemshala din, afal pi she'ein sham melech ela rosh memshala hanimchar lekama shanim. He says, even if there is no king, you still have an obligation to pay taxes and to follow the law of the government. And therefore, tax evasion in Chutz La'aretz is, the consensus is that it's going to be awesome. Okay. Any questions or comments before we go back to our original text? Okay, so I'm going to stop this share, and let's go back now to the Imrei Yaakov. I think we've seen perhaps sufficient sources to clearly indicate that there's really no justification to pay cash under the table. Is there anyone that would like to defend the practice? No, don't all speak up at once. Okay.
I would say, Rabbi, just like we briefly said yesterday, there are certain services that are just, it's part of our culture that we, that is the way things are done. Like I gave the example yesterday of the domestic help lady, and there are a few services like that that it's part of the way the system works, basically.
Can you give us some other examples besides domestic help?
Sometimes a small little handyman job could come about where somebody's not really necessarily registered like a business.
Okay. I would agree, I guess, but that's true. Although I think those are becoming increasingly less common. You know, I've been using more recently. I've used this. I had a handyman service, and I paid HST because there are a lot of people who call themselves handymen who set themselves up as a business. So I'm not really sure. You know, I have to be honest with you. When I first moved here, a guy was referred to me, a plumber was referred to me, to do a job in my house, and he's involved in construction. And he offered me the opportunity to pay cash without paying HST, and I said, no, I'd rather pay the taxes if it's all the same to you. Like I was taken off guard because although I've grown up being used to not paying domestic help, sales tax and or HST, that was the only situation where I understood that this was overlooked by the government. But I'm not really so sure anymore that you can justify it with a handyman. Are there any other examples that we can think of that, like
babysitter would be one possibly, or tutoring for a couple hours?
Right. That's true. I would say tutoring, but even but those are small jobs, and like Shmuel said yesterday, it still becomes the obligation of the person who you've employed to pay their taxes. And if they earn less than, what was it, Shmuel, $30,000 a year?
That's right. That's sales. A lot of people, especially domestics, they may be employed someplace else, and they do the cleaning on the side to make extra money. But as long as their sales from this type of business is less than $30,000 a year, they're not obligated to register for HST, and there would no be obligation to give them the HST. But they have to report it on their income tax return that they've earned and pay the income tax, not the HST, but the income tax.
Okay.
Rabbi, I've also come across where it's there's been situations, especially for people who are dealing with the elderly or situations where you need care for a day here or there. Sometimes the choices may be limited, and you may have to resort to somebody who will only work for cash. I've been through that situation a few times.
Right.
For short periods of time.
Right. So, when you require a service and the only available service provider is someone who says, I only take cash, that's an interesting question. I think that you can make a justifiable argument that either I need this to help someone in a dire situation, like in a health situation that you described for an elderly person. I think you can make the argument that it's the obligation of the person that you're paying to pay to collect HST and to pass on the HST. The only issue, remember, we had said that if someone doesn't collect HST from me, I'm not the Goslin, he's the Goslin. What am I committing? I'm committing the prohibition of lifnei iver lo titein michshol. I'm aiding and abetting a person to commit an act of geza, right? So, there may be certain dire situations where you can justify it because you need to help someone who's in a situation where their health is at risk, like you suggested, Ron. But as a general rule, a person should say to himself, why would I want to help someone steal from the government? And so that really should be the first question that comes to mind when a person says, I take cash only. I remember a couple of years ago, this is maybe going back 4 or 5 years, I ordered food from a restaurant here. And I asked, how much do I owe you? And he said, well, if you bring cash, it'll be this amount. And I said to him, look, I'm the rabbi of the Bayit. I live in this community. Why would you not want to collect HST and pass it on to the government? That's not right. I actually told him who I was. And I said, and his response to me was, I pay my taxes. I pay plenty of taxes. And he started to get scared. because maybe he thought I was going to report him or something. But I try not to patronize that place because it's not right. It's just not right. So, okay. All right, we'll hold it here for today. We'll continue I think we've I think we fairly exhausted this topic. There's probably if you ever think of other scenarios where you feel that there's a justification for tax evasion, I really do want to hear it, because it's not like I'm trying to be the goody two shoes here. It's just that I think that our objective in learning this material is to say, halacha does dictate how we handle our finances, and unfortunately, there's shenanigans that go on in the Orthodox community that are not in compliance with halachic directives, and that's unfortunate, but it's a reality. Okay, take care.